Hello, good day, freshman architects. Welcome to batch conference number 3. So, in this session, we'll discuss three things. Number one, I'll briefly give a synthesis of the contents of module number 3. And then, secondly, I'll discuss also the results of the mood models, which is your minor plate number 2. And then, lastly, I'll synthesize what we have covered and then introduce you to the next module. So, let's begin. So for module 3, we discussed or we learned two very important aspects of architectural design, which is form and space. So form can be divided into at least these elements or these components: the defined area, or what I always emphasize is the volumetric limit. So there's the height, there's the length and width, where you will specifically place your structure and your space. So there's the focus, which is as area, a point of concentration in the interior within a space, barrier or vertical divisions, platform extrusions, horizontal extrusions from the ground, support like columns and beams and truss, openings like windows and doors, markers are focal points. What focus is in the interior is marker for the exterior. So what catches the attention from the outside is what we call a marker. So also the roofing or ceiling and pathways. So these elements of form are physical, are visual. They are what we can regard as the quote-unquote Lego pieces which we arrange and we put together, combine in order to form a structure. So they're more physical, they're more easily, they are more tangible. On the other hand, space can be described as the quality of light, the the ambience from the colors, the sound, the temperature, ventilation, the smell, the textures, the scale, and the orientation. So in a sense, in a big sense, space is something ephemeral. Ephemeral in a sense that it's intangible, it's not easily captured, it's not easily defined, but it's very important because space it is what humans enter into. That's what we occupy. And form and space are really contingent and interrelated when it comes to design. The way we arrange the physical elements of form will inevitably influence the quality of space inside. So, and the quality of space inside or the need for a certain quality of space inside will also dictate the way the physical form is to be constructed or designed. So both of these um, elements are very important in architectural design. So I'd like to just make and point out these distinctions so that whenever we say the formal quality of a building, it will be very clear to us what we are looking at. We are looking at the physical elements of the building, the quality of the area, the focus or the points of concentration inside, the quality of the type of openings, I mean the characteristics of the roof, the way the pathways are arranged, and etc. So we are when we describe the formal qualities of a building, we try to describe the physical aspects of it. But when we describe the space, we describe it in terms of light and color and an overall experience. Okay, so to break that down, I have set at least 4 questions. So when we design, we start with the visible parts of a space. So we've discussed that just a while ago. So the area and all of these visible aspects. So we start with an area or a volumetric limit because that's the first very important aspect component of form, to know the limits of your design, your structure. And then of course, adding all of these elements. And then knowing that when we are arranging these visible parts or the formal components of a structure, we are not just assembling because we are creating a sculpture. The end product is at the back of our heads. When we arrange these formal components, we are ultimately designing the space within. The way we define or the way we put openings will influence the quality of light inside. The paint that we choose for the walls, for the barriers, will influence the ambient color, the sounds that comes into the interior, as well as the temperature. If you put a ceiling that is made of glass, or a skylight, a roofing that is made of glass, we call that a skylight. That will influence the temperature, the ventilation. If we decide to put interior plants or flowering elements inside, this will affect the smell. And if we use coarse textured wallpaper, or very fine tiles, dark tiles, that will in overall affect the texture and the scale of the space. So it's important to note that, because we are now deviating from our first project, which was to create a Narcissus doll. In the Narcissus doll, what we focused on is just, of course, the volumetric limit, but we assembled the parts for the sake of assembling the parts, and in order for it to be seen from the outside. But in this second project, in your corridor, we introduced the importance of space. We introduced into the arranging a necessary component or understanding of the space within that structure or within that sculpture. That is not to say that we cannot make artistic or sculptural buildings, but that is to make another component, introduce another component, which is space. So overall, that space will have a summative characteristic. Okay, so how we arrange them will influence the space, the conditions of the space, the light, the color, and the sound, and overall in total, that will have a certain quality. So for example, clean, or relaxing, or and all those descriptive terms that we can attribute to an object. But the higher intent of all design is that we have an effect on the user, an emotion or a thought or a feeling that the space will evoke from the user. I recently came across a very short video describing or delineating the difference between a designer and an artist. And when we are creating architecture, we are designing. We are designers, not artists. Because design requires or demands the understanding of the user, how to use it. Design requires non-explanation. If you need to explain, this is the door, this is where you go, well, that can be indicative of a very poor design. But a good design will be intuitive, will be experienced, will be understood easily by the user. That's not to say that we cannot design complex spaces, but in that complexity, we still have a clear message to convey to the user. On the other hand, art is so open to interpretation, so open to meaning making. So when we are creating a painting, for example, we just drew a flower on a table. While that is clear that it's a flower on a table, it can be open to many other interpretations, like death, or pruning or growth or beauty, the beauty of youth, the beauty of aging, or etc. So it is open, and the more meanings and interpretations, the better the art is, because the better you conjure emotions. But that's not the case in design. In design, you have to have a clear message which has to be understood by all. Okay, so while architecture is art, it is also hugely science, and what we do in design is not just to interpret ourselves as architects, artists. It's not just to express ourselves, but ultimately to be understood by our end users. So that's very important to note. And that's, I mean, a very big leap from your artist perception, perhaps in your first first plate. Okay. So in minor plate number 2, I tasked you to design 2 corridors with contrasting experiences and concepts. So you were given a volumetric limit, which is an elongated deep space. So that's one point to consider. It was 3 meters wide and 8 meters high, if I'm not mistaken, or 6 meters high. And then it's 8 meters deep. So it's a deep space. It's a 1.1-way space. So, and then also I required you to have a focal point at the end of the wall, and then work with lights and colors and texture, because that's perhaps the most applicable um, spatial components here. We cannot work with temperature and etc. But of course, all of that elements in the space, like color, temperature, texture, are all in there, except that we will, I encourage you to focus on light, colors, and texture. Okay, so the design solution here can be enumerated as follows. So when a space is deep and elongated, so our design solution tends to balance that inherent limit or inherent weakness in a volumetric limit, because it's so elongated, and in a deep space the tendency is to be suctioned into the focal object. So that one of the design solutions is to visually widen the space without essentially widening or increasing the width of the actual corridor, but you can visually widen the space or break the depth, because it's so deep, break the depth into several sections to make it more less intimidating and less mysterious, or more gradual and slow. It slows down the visual suction to the focal object, because being sucked into a space is not a good experience. It's not a good it's not particularly an inviting not a particularly inviting user experience. Okay, so widen the space. If it's too narrow, widen the space, break the depth, and slow down the visual suction to the focal object. If the space is too high, for example, too high, it's 2 stories high, and it calls for a very intimate you want an intimate or a homey experience, you bring down the height by introducing a ceiling, a false ceiling, or something horizontal to break the height. So what I'm saying is, every volumetric limit has an inherent weakness. And that's a very good point to look for when we are reading or analyzing a design problem. We look for the inherent weakness in the volume, and our design solution will tend to balance that out. If it's too elongated, like rectangular and wide, we break that down so that it's not so wide, and people do not have the perception that it's a tiring corridor to walk into, or it's a very long walk that's very tiring. So we try to solve the inherent weakness of a volumetric limit. Okay, so I had deduced at least 7 themes from all your submissions. I tried to incorporate everything I did, and not just the good ones, in order for all of us to learn and to learn and and know what to look for when we are designing. Okay, so I'll start with the first theme, which are dynamic shadows. So set this set of design for this corridor has shadows, very sharp, crisp, and well-defined shadows that created interesting textures within the space. It's dynamic because since the source of light varies throughout the day, so we expect that space to vary all throughout the day also. So this is the first example. So we see here that a shadow cast on the plain wall on the left side. So the whole wall is filled with the shadows from the pierced wall or pierced screen on the right side. Also the color combination here, orange. The orange tends to enhance the color brown. Okay, so when green and orange are complementary, so the designer chose green to be the focal point, so it became focal because of the contrasting color here. So we also notice a textured end wall, which is made up of irregularly with irregular texture, diagonals and slanted, which is also consistent with the general lines of the shadows. All right. So next, this one, the pattern shadow cast on the wall, which looks like a herringbone pattern, almost a herringbone pattern. So the linear fine texture of the shadow broke or broke down the depth or ang 8 meters na layo. Okay, so 8 meters is a far walk, relatively far walk. So um, the horizontal bands, the fine texture, um, essentially again counteracted the inherent weakness of the space, which is being sucked into the visual feeling that you're sucked into a space. And the repeated arches breaks the depth. The repeated arches adds volume, and repeated things are actually pleasant to the eyes when it's repeated just the right number. This one also is interesting because of the diagonal shadows cast from the diagonal triangular diagonal windows on the left side. Okay, so and because of the color, I am assuming that those glass are stained glass or tinted glass with a tinge of purple. So it's it gave ambient color, which is very subtle and welcoming also. All right, very subdued. Okay, so the diagonal and slanted shapes break the rectangular profile, which can also be a good design solution when it's too rectangular and you want to create variety in the experience. Then you break that rectangular profile, and this is a good way to do that. Next, here is one of the few examples with multi-layered shadows on the floor and on the surface. When you look at the shadows, there are dark shadows, and then there are shades, there are lighter gray shadows, and there are various layers of the shade and shadows cast from the wall, opening the wall to the ceiling, continuous opening from floor to ceiling. I mean, wall to ceiling. Okay, so these intersecting textures are very interesting, and notice that because of the designer chose to use just a single or a very simple color combination, and that went well with a very complex shadow pattern, because if it was a very complex shadow on varied colors, then the shadows can be very overpowering also visually. Okay, so the plants at the end, though they might look a little withered, but we will assume that's an installation, three-dimensional installation piece, and its color the darkest. It's chosen, its color is the darkest, so it makes it a focal object also. But the most interesting thing in this design is, I think, the multi-layered shadows. Next one, this one has pattern shadows cast on the wall, which visually created a symmetry, a visual balance, symmetrical balance. Okay, so but in the morning, perhaps when the light is not casting these sharp shadows, that wall will be a rich brown color, and in the evening or in the late afternoon, you have that visual symmetrical corridor with all these patterns. So I think those bold shapes and the general visual character is very interesting, in the way that the pier screen and the patterns are placed. Okay, so we also see here that the floor and the ceiling, also the end wall, um, are of one color. This floor is depth, but contrasting wall colors visually slows down the eyesight. So the same color, the floor, the end wall, and the ceiling highlights the depth of the space. Okay, but that's broken. That's balanced by the darker colors of both the walls and the texture. That's why does not look too claustrophobic. All right. Next, this one, the stained glass effect on the wall is, I think, very nice against all the black surfaces. The stained glass came from the ceiling. The effect was from the ceiling. On the left side, you see a clear window. There are also very slender vertical elements, column-like elements breaking up the corridor. That's very important, again, to slow down the visual suction. And I think that globe or circular orb at the end have to be lighted in order to be a focal object. But in this case, what became the focal element is the shadow on the left side, on the right side, which I think is a very good idea. It just placed the right amount of interest in an otherwise black room. Next, this one, the coarse wall textures created by the very huge planks of wood on the left side and at the end wall, is very well contrasted by the fine shadows created by the window open grills or wooden grills on the right side. So that's coarse and fine in one space. Coarse texture and fine shadows in one space. I think that's very important. That's to highlight also. There's the natural look of the wood, green and browns, against a white clean floor, so that those contrast is very important. So if we color the walls like this one, all the walls are of the same material, and then the floor and the ceiling is again a lighter shade and of the same color, that tends to decrease the height, which in some cases also is very good visually. Alright, so this one, the shadows complete the openings on the wall and the ceiling. So you notice that the openings cast shadows, cast a shadow, para holistic siya, nabuo siya because of the openings and the shadows casted. So these rhythmic linear patterns, though not strictly symmetrical, break the depth, and it's very interesting to see because they're not strictly lined up. They are distributed within the space. The rectangular form is broken down and broken down into squares, into small receding squares. All right. Next, this one, the colored shadows create several lines on the space. So on the floor, you have intersecting diagonal lines. On the wall, you have vertical lines, and there's two cove or openings or cove from that runs from the ceiling to the end wall. These what the designer did with a cove in the ceiling, on the ceiling running to the end wall, that emphasizes the suction, visual suction, that emphasizes the depth of the and tends to speed up the travel, visual travel from where you're standing to the focal point. But because of the fine and repeated vertical lines on either side of the wall, that visual suction created by um, the concave pattern lines on the ceiling are counteracted. Okay, so that's what I mean by trying to balance it out, trying to balance it visually, balancing it out visually. Okay, so this one, so very interesting because there's a word pattern on the floor. It's a very interesting feature. I actually think that is very doable in the real world. You'll just have to have a ceiling that's carved out with a certain word, and you put in artificial light behind that, backlit, so lighting the word, and that's, I think, a very interesting detail. Notice also that at the end wall there's a broken diagonal lighted from the back of I think that broken diagonal or diamond also expands the space. When anything is not completed, like half circle or three-fourth circle, it tends to extend or expand the space, your sense of space. Okay. What highlights the depth here is the red carpet or the red flooring or the red paint on the floor. Okay, so it's narrow. It narrows further the corridor, but because of the diagonal backlit broken diamond at the end, it counteracted all the things that the dark red elements did here, which is to emphasize the depth. All right. Next is the ceiling pattern here formed by openings, which is an interesting contrast to the dark space. So that's perhaps supposed to be a tempo or a reading in a cardiac monitor. I'm not sure, but it's an interesting way to introduce horizontal elements to break up the depth of the corridor. Also notice a very faint diagonal sharp lines on either side of the wall, which matches well with the patterns on the floor, also irregular, and also the diagonal sharp edges on the ceiling. So these all contribute to a sense of unity. But again, when you look at the space, it's closed. It's closed and it's going towards the end wall, which at this point it's not clear enough if that's a painting or a window or a stack of books. But I must emphasize that lines are like arrows. Lines tend to point. You have to have an ending when you are pointing or introducing a line, because that will reward. That's a cognitive reward to the user. Okay, next. This one, there are diagonal and sharp shadows also, but more subtle shadows. And notice that because of the shadow, the lighted shadow, there's varying shades of blue in the space. Okay, because of those pierced openings on the right side of the wall. On the left side, you also see very subtle textures, but the texture and the shadow all work together because the color is very well thought out. Okay, so the next theme is called Vibrant. Um, these are the designs with extravagant use of surface colors and or textures. They tend to emanate with a backstory or a sense of mystery. They are nostalgic, otherworldly, or in some cases, too realistic for a model. And most and or some did attempt to distort the deep rectangular volume. So this is the first vibrant design. It's vintage throwback aesthetic. You see the use of bold colors, which are red, fiery red, black, and white. There are square patterns on the floor and ceiling break. And on the ceiling also are square patterns that both of them break the depth created by the black band on the wall. So the black band of the walls tend to point and speed up your vision towards the end object. But because of these square patterns on the wall and on the ceiling, and of course the windows on the right side, upper right side, that speed is counteracted. You also see the wall decor on the left side, which are timepieces, matches the the whole aesthetic well. And I think that focal object at the end is a they call this a machine. I forgot the name, but it's a machine where you just place a coin and it dispenses whatever beverage or food or objects in that object. I apologize. I completely forgot, slipped of my mind. This object. All right. So next, this one. So the black end wall provided high contrast for the gold focal object. We see here the textured pierced screen on the left create interesting shapes on the wall with black patterns. We see the black patterns perhaps of simplified butterflies. On the right side, there are also flowers. I think the pear screen is for flowers. So that's I think a very interesting concept. Flowered pear screen and then the shadows on the wall where the shadows will be cast are butterflies. So I think that's a very poignant idea. Alright, so extravagant gold and warm colors. Next, this one, completely distorted, but yet visually balanced sense of space. It's distorting because you are not quite sure because of the diagonals where the exact volumetric limit is, and your sense of rectangle is somehow lost. But in a good way. The glittering red is a good contrast to the black, and also the floating diagonals created by the underlighting, because the diagonals are lighted under, looks like it's lighted with white light underneath, gave the illusion of it being floating. So I think it's a very extravagant use of shapes, lines, and colors. Next, this one, the rhythmic arches give the illusion of misalignment, sense of mystery, and expedition. I think it's ingenious. I'm not quite sure if that's perfectly aligned, but it looks like from this shot, because I'm limited with the photographs that you sent me, the illusion of misalignment is actually very interesting here. Okay, next, the overall color scheme and shape arrangement is playful and creates visual moving but not confusing space. Perhaps because of the color combination chosen. Um, it's on the light side, candy-like. So even with all the with all the layered textures and multicolors, is all still very visually coherent. We also notice here that the end product is totally out of league in a sense, which I think is a very surprising contrast. Okay, next, this one. The neon colored elements is visually orderly because of uniform vertical arrangement, which I think worked because the designer placed strictly in a regular pattern all these neon colored elements side by side in a very um, uh, strict posture or position. If it had been diagonal neon and diagonals, it would have been perhaps a little bit more confusing, visually confusing. But the way that they are arranged, these neon colored elements, bright colored elements, worked in this case. So the end object, though, I'm not sure what that is, but I think that's a sculpture of an angel or something, or looks like some sort of a three-dimensional object. Okay. Next, in this design, the pink. I'd like you to notice how pink or orange or yellow enlivens brown, the brown color or the brown hue. It also enlivens gray. So these brown, gray, they need a sharp contrasting color to make them more alive and surprising. And in this case, it worked. The shade of the brown, the rich natural brown, contrasted well with the shade of pink chosen by the designer. So the fine textured vertical walls, notice the very fine corrugation on the walls, contrast with the coarse texture of the floor, and which continues to the end wall. I'm not sure if that's supposed to be stone, like pink stone or something, or chimney at the end, but it looks coarse, but also very, in a good way, contrasting to um, the brown walls. So the visual experience reaches the wall immediately because the ceiling is also very prominent. So one of the examples I said an element can really direct your attention to the end wall, to the back wall abruptly. Okay, although there are columns, half columns, engaged columns on the either side of the wall, but they're colored very brown, also close to the color of the wall. So since they do not contrast, uh, they are not high contrasting with the wall, they do not um, tend to break down the space, the deep space, into smaller squares. Rather it again, the suction, being suctioned into the end wall, is more prominent here. All right. So okay, so this corridor is has multiple textures and shapes, but they are all made orderly by the color combination, which is gold, black, and white, which is extremely wise. Again, if you have many textures and shapes, you lie low on the color. And if you have lots of color, then you relax on the shape. So notice that in the design, we really tend to balance out each of these elements. So all the surfaces, the walls, the floor, and the ceiling have regular shape. Notice that the ceiling, you see there are rectangular shape. On the left side, on the right side, are rectangular paintings, openings, as well as on the floor, very regular. But the floating arches give the volumetric contrast to the rigid lines. It's a pseudo arc which floats on the space. So in a rhythmic pattern because repeated. I think that's a good contrast to the regular shapes. Okay. Next theme is horizontal divide. So these designs have deep rectangular volume, effectively divided into smaller sections. so visually decreasing the tunnel experience. So that's what I was thinking a while ago. The tunnel experience, the sense that you're being sucked into a space. All right, so these dark colored beams on the ceiling, okay, the sectioned even door windows on the right side, even and repeated, and wall paintings on the left side widens the narrow corridor. Okay, so because it's too deep, introducing something that's perpendicular to the depth tends to widen it. This is also another design with the same solution to put beams on the ceiling, prominent beams. Beams are horizontal support system that carries the roof, or they can be false beams if like this they carry or they're placed below the ceiling. So these natural wood colored beams and the floor visually places horizontal section to the space, and also it decreases height. Although the floor is the orientation of the floor boards are parallel to the long side, the horizontal beams on top are prominent and wide enough, big enough to counter that visual tunnel experience. Okay, so the wide open window on one side visually widens the space also. So this is a very bright and cozy aesthetic. You would imagine it a corridor for beside the garden or beside the farmhouse. It's very interesting. So this one also is another somewhat similar to that design before. This time the rich brown and deep grayed wood. As you see the grains of wood on the floor and on the ceiling. Um, Places horizontal sections on the space, decreasing the height and increasing the width. Okay, so the wide open window on one side visually widens the space. It has a cabin-like aesthetic, not quite because there are no stone no textures. I mean, but the wooden combination, all in all, is I think very good. All right. Okay, here it's somewhat similar elements with different combination. So I hope you notice that even with the same volumetric limit and with almost the same color combination, you could still have different experiences and spatial quality um, depending on very few things that you tweak. For example, here we do not see those as beams because they're too small. They can be perhaps moldings on the ceiling. Okay, and you see here that because the ceiling was colored darker than all the rest of the surfaces, than the walls and the floor, that dark ceiling tends to decrease the height. So when you have a very high wall or ceiling, I mean, and you want to visually bring that down, you color that ceiling dark. Okay, also on the right side, we can see here from this side perhaps a frosted window, frosted wall window, or a frosted glass wall which admitted light on the left side into the space. So I think that door window also broke down the depth and the tunnel experience. All right. This one, the I mean, focal object is a contrast against the white and light brown space with subtle shadows which created subdued and quiet rhythm. So we see here that the moldings on the ceiling, because I think those are moldings rather than beams, are finer, mas slender, mas spaced, mas thinner, more slender, spaced more closely. So it gave a more fine texture. All right. This one, it's actually very realistic in a sense. It's a room because that's a door on the left side. It's a corridor of a house, perhaps. Um, yeah, I remember. This is from a series. series, a Korean series. I think it was inspired by that series, and the designer took her inspiration from that movie or that show, and used that to create this corridor. So the dividing walls, notice the molding which divided the walls into the two halves. The upper half is pink, the lower half is white. Um, that made the space more intimate. And when you divide the wall that way, it tends to again break down or decrease the height. All right. So in some cases that can be useful visually. It creates a more homey feel. All right. So the semicircular windows at the right side, the coffered ceiling, the repeated lighting fixtures break down the depth of the corridor. Although very, very subtle, it's there. These elements, repeated elements, break down the tunnel weakness of the corridor. All right. So next, the dark brown wall and floor contrast well with the sharp shadows and slatted ceiling. All right. So the continuous beam to half column create visual sections. So what I like here, again, you see the molding that divides the space into two, divides the wall into two, upper and lower half. Okay, so those tend to, again, speed up your vision from where you're standing to the end of that line. But because of all these, the bold brown color and also the floor pattern, all of these things balance out. Of course, the beams, horizontal beams, balance each other out. Next is the lines on the floor. This is an example of enhancing the tunnel experience. The lines on the floor, which abruptly leads the eyes to the end wall, which is a very small, I don't know, a sculpture of the moon. All right. But however, the repeated light post on each of the side of the wall gives a steady visual pulsation in contrast with the floor. So if those lights were not there, then the tunnel experience will be very, very evident. Because the color overall scheme is dark, but because of those lights, repeated, slender, and repeated and almost full height, a sense of the effect created by the lines on the floor is somehow counteracted. All right, here you see the black beams create horizontal divisions once again. And one good thing also is how the focal objects is a good contrast to the dark overall palette. There are paintings on the left side and on the, I think, the right side, there are wall installations, but they're all in black and white neutrals. But the focal objects on the end side of the wall is a sharp contrast. Okay, here we see again the use of horizontal beams and windows. They divide the long corridor. We also see a very interesting floor pattern, which is a good contrast to the bare walls. White lang ang walls. The ceiling is a light wood finish. However, the wall decor can be simplified since the floor pattern is already rich with texture. So again, if you have complicated texture on one side, then make sure that on the other side opposite it can be more orderly or regular in order to provide a good visual contrast. Next set I call the expanded space. So space in these designs is connected to another space. When you look at the corridor, you notice and you have a sense that it's part of a space, bigger space. So we also saw some of these expanded spaces previously, but not as pronounced as this set. Okay, so once again, all of the elements of space, the ventilation, ventilation, the smell, the orientation are all really coexisting in one dimension. Okay, so these designs are all also oriented towards the exterior rather than the end wall, and then they uh, they seem to be more extroverted spaces with contextual environment. So this an example. So we see here that the window on the left is looking outside, and also the chair is looking outside, oriented towards outside. We also see here elements that break up the depth of the space. The wheel paintings on the right side, very regular, same size, square rather than rectangular, and the windows, of course. We notice here that the floorboards are again oriented perpendicular, I mean parallel to the long side, which tends to speed up the visual travel. However, because of the broken brown textured walls on the left side, right side, and at the end wall, that tend to again balance out the effect of the parallel floorboards. You also notice a lighting fixture um, in the middle of the section, which is also an interesting contrast to break down the vertical or the depth of the space. Next, here we see again the windows oriented outside. We see the floor oriented towards the end wall, but because it's colored light and because the windows on the left are also big and significant in size, as well as the blank wall on the right side, then the visual tunneling is averted also. We see here what looks like um, a table with cabinets and a painting at the end with a carpet. All right, here. Yes, that's the end object. Perhaps you go there to get fresh laundry or linens or paint supplies. I don't know. All right, next. Here, see here everything is subdued pastel-like. I'd like to mention again the um, I'm not sure exactly what that is on the left side. I think that's um, rather than a wallpaper, that's a view into the city. So if that is the case, then this whole wall is really an open wall, and it makes the corridor oriented outside visually at least. If it's not, if it's a full wallpaper, then it still gives some sort of illusion that this space is part of a bigger space. Okay, I'd like also to mention the pattern on the ceiling right before the painting at the end. It's very interesting. It's a good contrast to the very simplistic horizontal um, um, patterns on the ceiling as well. And also these granite like or crack design cracks on the right side. It's a good subtle detail. Next is one. Notice the piers, the fine metal work on the left side, creating dynamic shadows. So well, I chose to put it here because it's the way that the whole wall was opened, and how the whole wall is the whole design of the wall on the left side opened or connected the corridor to other parts of this house perhaps. Also notice the vertical um, elements on the right side of the wall painted with, I think that's gold. It's also a nice way to counteract the tunnel experience. So this one also you see here how these are somehow predictable or um, common or common grill work pattern. I'm not saying it's by common in a good way. Familiar, I think, is a more appropriate word. A familiar grill work pattern, but notice how that those semicircular windows want invites you to look outside, and perhaps as a, this as a part of a larger courtyard or a larger library or a second floor of something. Okay, with a portrait of perhaps the owner at the end of the wall. Also notice the flooring details. I mean the texture on the floor. The texture on the end wall is contrasted by the white ceiling, and that's a good choice. Full colors on either side of the wall, if I'm not mistaken. A full wall, a full floor with patterns and an empty ceiling. That's a good, I think. I think that's a good combination. Next one, you see also another almost similar window pattern, but this one, it's one big humongous opening. Um, it's also symmetrical, but on the other side there are no supports. But it opened up the space. So if you can still remember the corridors before, which were closed, this was is a good. I mean, this is a different effect and experience. Notice also the dark colored what do you call this, frame or cove or molding on the ceiling pattern that made or that counteracted again the depth of the space, because it's shorter than what the depth of the corridor. Okay, so that chandelier is a good contrast to the perhaps rustic overall feel. And of course the black unbacklit na sculpture at the end also is a good um, detail, in the sense that it can still be seen even during daylight because of the backlighting. All right. Next, this one is a piano room, I guess. Notice the very well made piano. That's really a three-dimensional piano made from scratch. Notice how the the space is distorted because of the slanted ceiling and the view to the sky, view to the left side of fields, and the horizontal floorboards. Very interesting. Perhaps what's missing here is the piano stool. Where do you sit down when you play the piano? Or perhaps, okay, so that's why those are just small details. I mean, okay, next. Yeah, okay. So this one, you see, notice here the slanted ceiling work. Okay, so casted shadow also, but you want to gaze up to the sky because of these openings, expanded the space. Okay, we also notice here the white patterns. So again, those, because they are parallel to the wide section of the corridor, they tend to increase the depth, but because of these shadows and the windows repeated horizontal, which breaks that, introduces perpendicular elements into these long white lines on the floor. Okay, so those that depth is visually counteracted. Next here, you see the the doors on the right side expands the space. The windows on the left side. And what's an interesting element here is the continuous pattern from the floor to the wall to the ceiling. I think that's a very good way to have broken down or sectioned the depth of this corridor. And on the ceiling, you see there very volumetric lighting fixtures. Okay. So next, this one, you notice here the remember a while ago there's a dark brown frame cove in the ceiling or molding in the ceiling, which again decreases the width and the depth of this corridor here. That's the floor. So because of that the smaller rectangle, um, it shortened the depth of the wall. Although of course it also gave the narrowed somehow the corridor, but because of the vertical windows on the right side, that was also visually counteracted. And also what's interesting is I think that's a rotating wind wind mobile at the end as the focal object. All right. Next here, I think this is a kindergarten children's room, kids room. Notice how again we divide the space into two. Lower half is green, upper half is blue, so that it reduces the height of the room. Okay, so notice the the regular but I mean the arrangement of the windows are also playful or somewhat deviating from what's I mean expected. Excuse me. So and the end objects are, I think, a study area. There's a table. They have chairs, but there's a shelf. Okay. So those are the sharp shadows, which are also interesting. They're located exactly where the student will not be, I mean, hit by the shadow because the last window is located upwards rather than below. Alright, this is, I think, a part of a Japanese house. Okay, so on the right side is perhaps a sliding door wall. On the right side is a window. Notice the floor pattern is towards the end wall, but because of the very imposing left and right moldings of the window and the room, the doors, it again reduced the depth. All right. Next, this looks eerily realistic. This is a corridor in a hospital bay, almost like copied from real life. And I'd like you to notice how the wall is divided again into two colors. The lower part is blue, and then there's a molding, and then the upper part is white. Of course, everything in the hospital is functional, designed precisely for functional purposes. That blue band between the walls is actually a hand bar or a grab bar for patients walking along the corridor. They have to have something to hold on to if they feel dizzy or something. Okay, so the minimum corridor for hospitals, clear corridor width for hospitals is 3 meters. 3.5 is optimum. Okay, so I think that's an exit door. Exit doors in hospitals should have a um, door, automatic closing door, fire door. Okay. Next, we see here on the right side are the reflection of water. I'm not sure if that's from the painting or if you enter the space, you don't know that this is just a model. You enter the space and you can assume that beside this corridor is a swimming pool because of the way the reflection is casted on the right side of the wall. Okay, so I think that's a very interesting interplay of light and shadow. So you notice also the molding, the white molding on top between the ceiling and the wall. So that creates, again, it decreases the visual height of the corridor space, making it more relatable, not as imposing or as intimidating, reducing the tunnel effect. This one's very nice. We see here on the right side is a brick wall, pattern wall, imposing black lines, both horizontal and vertical. At the end, you see a set of furniture, and on the left side, you see vertical um, windows, door windows. So they function much like the imposing columns. They break down, introduce vertical elements, emphasizing the height, emphasizing the sections rather than the depth. Okay. So this one also, you see here, is somewhat similar, but the elements here are on the right side are the paintings in three. So again, um, breaks down the depth. On the left side, you see two huge arches, window arches. Alright, so also there are seating area. Parang kulang ng table. But of course, perhaps that's just for seating and texting. Alright, this also has somehow a similar design profile. On the right side, there's a blank wall. On the left side, um, windows with semicircular endings. The back wall is a stone wall, which is a very good contrast to the overall color and material selection. Notice here the floor is black and white, but it's oriented like parallel, not parallel, but diagonal against the length of the corridor, which is good because, again, diagonals here, like in this case, expands the space. Next, yeah, these are the elements. Yeah, here we see that floorboards are parang one thing I've noticed here is that practically if you build this, the ceiling material and the floor material has to be interchanged, because if you have those floor tiles, um, anyone can easily trip. So trip on those very uneven floor surfaces. So that's very important in choosing floor materials. So, but this can work. This uneven surface can work on a ceiling, and the ceiling flat surfaces with wooden grains can be the floor. All right. So I think the end focal object here is a lighting fixture. I think you notice also that the window is on the left side are windows. Windows are great ways to expand a space visually, and users tend to want or to prefer open spaces rather than closed enclosed claustrophobic spaces. So another way um, to expand space aside from windows, if you cannot make windows, is through mirrors. Okay, so this one, all the wall on the left side is opened, and I have issues with the scale of the door and the plant and the leaf. I mean, if that's real life, how big is that leaf? Is that a banana leaf? But then again, composition on the left side open, and on the right side the paintings, same theme, different paintings, three paintings, which um, is placed well, perhaps at the center of the whole corridor, and the low cabinet wall. The wall cabinet is, I think, a very good and interesting semi-outdoor space. Okay, perhaps beside a garden or beside a banquet area. Okay. Next, this one also have openings, but on the right side. You also notice the very sharp high contrast wooden vertical materials on the wall. So that's very heavy ang visual texture sa left side, contrasted by the very open um, barrier, or quote-unquote barrier, or limit or delineation, space delineation on the right side. Okay, so also see here a very multicolored end object. Here also, notice the effect of the wide windows with very fine grill work. Very interesting. It adds fine texture, and it breaks down the volume of a space, making it less imposing and more inviting. Also, what's important is how the carpet here reduce the depth of the space. Okay, and the colors are matching, or um, almost of matching or relevant, related to the focal object. Here is it's an interesting design. There's an attempt to make it really extravagant and um, serene. Perhaps this is by the beach, if I'm not mistaken, because of perhaps the blues. But that's a terrarium at the end, and you see how um, the big wide floor, I mean wall to ceiling opening, lights up the whole space. Okay, so that's very interesting also here. We also see wooden elements, column-like elements that are repeated along the right side of the wall. They balance out the depth of the space. Okay, here also very interesting. You see here a raised platform, one of the few that I saw with which introduce a raised platform, horizontal platform. Notice here also the wide open windows. Of course, in real life, you have to take into consideration safety. So if that's the depth of that floor to the bottom of the window has to be not less than 0.8 or 0.9, or in the new safety standards 1.1 meters, because if it's not, then and if it's just open, when you stand there and somebody pushes you, then you would fall off the end of the building. But it's interesting, the whole space is oriented outside. The color combination is also quite pleasant. Next, here it's also very nice design. You notice the pictures on the left, even the sides of this frame, the picture frames matches the focal object at the end, which is perhaps a, I think, fixture or a sculpture, ceiling mounted sculpture. Notice also how the end wall um, is accentuated with moldings that run from the floor to the parts of the ceiling, which tend to shout or draw attention to the end wall. But of course, we cannot discount the very open windows, which tend to like, draw your attention towards the landscape outside. Okay, also the continuous long band opening window and fixed window on top, um, which lines very well with the bottom of the painting. Very interesting. So next one, almost the same, but the window is more square than a series of smaller rectangles. Okay, so the color of the painting also matches with the floor, creating more unity and coherence. Okay, this one very interesting, looks real. I'm wondering what those things are at the end of. Are those people? Are those supposed to be people, or is that a sculpture? I'm not sure, but the wall again, if it's diagonal, it tends to expand the space. And then the repeated arches. Look at those arches, gorgeous. Yeah, 1, 2, 3. I think there are 4 arches, 5 arches from throughout the length of the whole corridor. The depth, which starts here. Okay, so I think that's very painstaking um, detail, architectural detail to create. All right, so these white patches, square patches on the beams are a good rhythmic element to emphasize horizontality, width rather than depth. Okay. Next here, this I think one of the more futuristic siguro ng mga design. However, it looks bare, tends to look bare rather than more futuristic. But it's a good base, I think. We see here how the wide open space draw your attention on the outside. Like the wall detail also is very interesting, unexpected but very interesting. Okay, so this one we see here the the subdued colors of the wall. Okay, which lights up with the light from the window and which matches the painting at the back end of the wall, and everything else is dark. So it's very it wants you to look at the source of light outside. Okay. Here, also here, see the source of light running from upper right, from the wall to the corner of the ceiling. Notice also the very interesting wall pattern, wall texture created by the wooden slats, vertical slats. We also notice here the gray floor, which contrasts well with all the natural wood. But again, browns and grays tend to be to need a brighter color to live in it. So it's good that the shade of the brown on the left side wall is a lighter wood stain rather than the dark brown on the right. Okay. So this one very looks real but old and I don't know, really mysterious. So that's a painting at the end. See a window series of one window, wide window placed on top with just enough sunlight. So it looks like it's really a part of a big house. All right. Okay, next, this one very interesting. You see here a full wall opening towards the outside. You see that. Also a car at the outside. You see perhaps it opens to a garage, parking area, or a lawn. Okay, notice the whole color combination, the crumpled flooring pattern is works very masculine, very modern also. Okay, next here by the same designer, different concept. It's darker this time, and then the reds and the green. That is an attempt to again contrast the dark color. All right, so here I think this is the last for this theme. We see here the continuous horizontal opening on this left side with louvers. Okay, and it casted. I'm not sure if the right side of the wall is color yellow or the light is yellow, but overall it's a very bright and sharp afternoon scene. Okay, which is of course contrasted by the dark floral floor material. So the next theme is focal setup. So these designs have a clear focal object at the end of the wall. So they have contrasting high character object for emphasis. So these are I think the designs that nailed the end wall clearly. So we see here how everything supports the painting at the end, the dark painting at the end. It looks like an old sanctuary or a convent. It's white, everything painted white, even with all the windows on the right side and the porches. But the focal point is the painting. So with this design, we see here the painting at the end of the corridor screaming attention, and its profile is consistent with the shape of the windows also. It's very good. Everything is white except for the painting, the focal object at the end with the color. So in a sense, that's a very good way to emphasize something. Next here we see a combination, a series or a set of things at the end of the corridor. We see there a low table, a carpet, plants, and some wall art against a white wall. And of course, we see the series of windows, very interesting. The floor is very realistic. So when you look at the space, it 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 doesn't suction you in like in a tunnel, but you see clearly firsthand the elements at the end wall. Next here also, perhaps what makes this the focal object here um, significant or successful, because it's a watch. The designer chose something that people tend to look at repeatedly to place at the end of the wall so that it becomes functional. So I think that's interesting. This wall pattern is also very good, which matches or complements well with the repeated square shapes on the ceiling leading up again to the clock. So that's a subtle pointing line towards the clock. Next, this one also, we see here the painting at the end, color black, and these four like frames, visual frames, clear visual frames, directing your eyesight from where you're standing to the painting at the end. This one also, here you see that the object is smaller. However, it's gold. It's in gold. It's gold statue, and you notice here also these elements pointing or like framing the whole end wall, as well as this black wide accent walls on each side of the corridor, as well as the red carpet, which is the red carpet is visually very leading or draws your vision visual the visual sensation towards the focal object at the back, which is a sculpture or a trophy, I think. All right. Okay, as well as this one, everything is white except for the flooring and the end artwork. The flooring is interesting because it doesn't draw you in like a straight line. It's still breaks it down slower, but nonetheless it leads to the end object. Next here also we see a painting at the back, and everything is empty except that. And I think the whole ambience of the or color ambient color of the space is because of the colored ceiling light, which render the spaces with a tinge of yellow. Okay, so the black border also is an interesting way to frame any space. It frames the space, it separates or creates a floating illusion. Next is one is it's very straightforward in its design. Everything is black except for the silver. What is that? Perhaps that in real life that would be a very big seal of a government or a politician. but it's made more softer by the horizontal wooden beams on the ceiling, suspended, which is made to look like they're floating above. So these horizontal ceilings, but these horizontal elements on the ceiling still visually leads to the end wall, which is okay. So this one, everything points to the end wall. The molding on the wall, the ceiling, the lighting on the edge of the baseboard, or the baseboard where the wall and the floor meets, or I don't know if that's intentional or not, as well as the shadow. Everything leads. So this one example where all the elements is parallel to the long side, it enhances the tunnel vision. But in this sense, it works because the end object, the focal object is uh, pointing in all directions. Okay, upward, sideward. So it balances that out. So this one, I want to title this of Tree of Life. Okay, so we see here that at the end, it's the only prominently lighted with a accent light, under light. So we also see here the columns, which sections the length of the wall. But again, the brightest object here is the tree at the end, which I think is good. It's a good way to emphasize an object. Everything is royal blue, dark blue. Even the shadows on the floor are patterns made by created by shadows from the ceiling. Okay, but even then, the brightest is the back side, or I mean the focal object at the end wall. Okay. Um, so is this is directional lighting, a lighting a piano. Again, the piano seat is missing, but that's a piano at the end. Everything is black. It works that the floor is colored with a lighter shade of brown, grayish brown, and of course it matches with painting at the end. Okay, this one looks very realistic. You see here the arch. The arch is a good way to frame the whole end wall. So if you have arches in your house, about for example, you have arch and then a dining area, be sure that when you stand in front of that arch, it frames an area. If it shows half of your dining table, half of a piano, half of anything of a sofa, then it tends to not be a very good not very good visually in terms of design. Arches like this tends to demand symmetry and focal emphasis. Okay, you see here the painting framed by the arch, also lighted by ornate chandelier. And you also sense that perhaps on the right side and the left is another corridor, a T corridor leading to somewhere. Okay, we also notice here these moldings on the wall um, create a very holistic look, formal, traditional look, um, by the same designer, I think also. See here again the same arch, not the same arch, but the same element, formal element, framing, trying to frame another object. Okay, so this one is very narrow. It points directly to the focal object at the end, and the frame is are twines. I don't think that is doable in real life. I don't know. Um, that needs to be perhaps placed with cushion, um, and it will not function then um, like a corridor, but like a seating area or a floor mat seating area, whatever. Okay, so the scale tends to be not consistent with real world object. But again, you see here how things can be framed by arches, by colors, by symmetry. Okay. Next here also, arches framing something. Perhaps that's a of course headgear of a warrior. Um, Perhaps on display there. Another one. This is a very interesting arch-like element on the ceiling. It's not really arch-like but it's a very interesting um, element in the corridor. Notice also the painting at the end, is the only bright color, and then the textures, rough textures, horizontal and vertical on all the walls. Okay, here also we see a huge, humongous plant at the end of the wall, the end wall. I really am wondering in real life what that monstrous landscape plant can be. I don't know, but of course there are varieties of landscape materials that have monstrous, large um, leaf patterns. Okay. Notice also how in this case the arches do not frame the end wall, but the two columns frame them. Okay. Just also I think enough. Okay, so you also notice the wide baseboard where the floor meets the wall. Okay. All right. This one, a chair, a throne-like chair is at the end of the corridor. It's the only thing that's lighted. It's also being framed by two columns. And okay, this one, the floor looks eerily too realistic. It looks really. I would have wanted on the left side to have a door rather than a painting to make it more like a room or a corridor leading to a room. But as it is, it's really this one example of flooring and ceiling detail that enhances the tunnel vision, except that and not in a bad way, but in a good way. And the thing that balances it is white, plain, cream-like off-white color of all the walls and the ceiling. If more parallel elements were placed on the wall on each side, then it will really enhance the depth of the corridor. Okay, yeah. You will wonder because again, lines lines like this have to have something at the end to make to be a reward for the user. So when I look at this, I am imagining that at when I look through those windows, I would see something throughout out in the garden or elsewhere that is really eye-catching to make my walk and my attention worthwhile. So again, be careful with working with lines because again, at the end of that line, you have to have some focal object to reward your user. Okay, this one, I think that's the wardrobe to Narnia because it's at the end of a corridor and it's isolated. And notice the gray and the blue, the bright blue, sky blue. That color combination also works. Okay. And the fine shadows on the left side. Okay, this one, both by the same designer. Really, on the left side, most especially, is a focal object was really emphasized. And the narrow corridor was further narrowed by the inclusion of really heavy walls, I mean heavy columns, repeated columns all throughout. It became narrower, but in this case, because of the seaming function, it worked. Because of the object at the end, at least for the left side picture, it feels like a pilgrimage to a religious pilgrimage to a site. On the right side, perhaps also a relic, but obviously this looks like buttons, but on the left side it really feels like a religious pilgrimage. Okay. Next one, this one. That the focal object is very mysterious. You don't know what that is. I'm not quite sure what that is. It looks like a black bronze or sculpture which is full height from the floor to the ceiling. Not sure, perhaps it needed more lighting. But the lights from the window is interesting, or the openings on the left side is interesting. Contrasts well with the dark interior of the space. This one is an aquarium, which, like the wall clock, is a very functional functional object to place at the end of a room. So you could travel there, and when you end there, although there are no fishes, of course, but you expect to be relaxed or to see interesting things at the end. Okay. So the next set is the ambient colors. So these designs have colored lighting, which gives a uniform color to the space, visually bright and high contrast wall colors. So the colors here are not essentially painted on the walls or on the texture, but in the light. That's what makes it extra interesting. So this is an example of that. So the light, perhaps in real life, that has to the color of the window has to have that tinge of blue and tinge of red in order to achieve this effect. Okay, so this is interesting. You see here that the color is the ambient color is produced by the light. Very interesting. This one also looks very real. It looks like a part of a samurai house, Japanese house. The lighting, very dramatic. All right. This one also, these are fairy lights. Your sense of space is rectangular, volume is completely distorted, but in a good way. You get confused with all these lights. I think that's too big in real life, but then again, lighted ambient colors. This one also, everything's pink, but not necessarily the walls or the walls even. Uh, Pink and then um, lighted with sharp white, so everything bounces back and forth in the space. Not quite sure what that end focal object is, but also this one by the same designer. So you see that the design relies heavily on the quality of the lighting. Um, yeah, on the left side you see tinges of blue and violet and pink, and of course black. I think Blackpink, if I'm not mistaken, is Korean band or girl group. Not a band, but it's a girl group. All right, on the right side is perhaps a stage for awards or for press con or for short appearances with a black ceiling for emphasis on the stage. Okay. Okay, this one. Okay, you see here almost the same corridor, almost the same corridor, with the same end focal product and the same lighting condition. But again, the yellow light enhanced the orange and the browns of the space and the greens. Orange, if in order in painting, if you want to make a green pigment more alive, you add orange to it. That also happens in real life. So when you have wood and you have plants and you add orange colors, and then your lighting has to have orange tint also. This one also in an orange like burnt orange brown like tone. I am not sure how that was achieved, perhaps because of the openings in the ceiling. But overall, the color is also enhanced by the paint itself, perhaps by the paint itself, because the color was so white, it bounced, and in a sense created a hazy hue from the raw wall paint. This one's interesting. It gradiates from the yellow light on the ceiling to the um, which is reflected on the floor. The reflection is not colored yellow anymore, but orange, perhaps because of the color of the floor, which is very glossy, very mirrorized floor. Okay, so you see there like a water glass-like effect. Okay, so you see that the end wall looks to appear as if it's floating. And notice the left and right brown blocks, also oriented and arranged in such a way to as if to look like it's floating. All right, next. This one, the color is on the wall, is painted on the wall, but the choice of light tend to enhance it and create several layers or shades of blue. Blue is a royal, especially this bright blue is interesting to work with in a space. It really gives life and energy to a space, not in a relaxing manner, but in a way that refreshes and wakes you up. This particular type of blue. Okay, so and also that's a watch. So perhaps that's an invitation to look repeatedly on the focal object. Next one, this one. When you look at it long enough, you get really distorted if that's a corridor horizontal or you're falling down. When you look at it long enough, you feel it feels like you're falling down. That's the effect of the black end wall with a white centerpiece, or the orange centerpiece. Orange lighted white centerpiece, rectangular centerpiece. Looks like you're falling if you look at it long enough. Interesting orange tinge, I think, from the wall, um, colored wall with backlit. I mean, when you do these models, when you do this, and in your next project, you also want to think in terms of reality. For example, how would this look like if this is real? I mean, how would this be done if this is real? Even if you're just guessing, then you would that's a good exercise to connect your design to reality. Because if it's too unrealistic, when you imagine it and you cannot think of anything that can be made, I mean, when it's real life that big, that scale, then perhaps you had to revisit the design. Yeah, this one, everything's in yellow. I am guessing that that's because of the window. The window is tinged with yellow. Yeah, this one is perhaps made to look very cold. Yes, the all of the materials and the arches and the blue light, perhaps from the window also. Okay, so these ones, as these last theme, I entitled Undesigned, not because of, essentially because the visual experience conveys decay, neglect, or austerity. And unless we are doing designing, quote unquote, designing a horror house or a theme space or a Halloween party setting, these cannot can, cannot be your design goals, because decay, neglect, and too much austerity is the result of time and not of design. But I'd like to highlight all of these because of the visual power that the designers were able to, the model makers were able to create in a short space, in a small space, I mean. Example, these are 3 examples, especially this, the one on the center. Everything is so realistic. But you do not design a space intentionally to be like this, even unless you're designing a horror house. But you do not want, this is a result. I'd like to imagine this space in its pristine form when it was first constructed. Perhaps the lecture, the first elements, I mean, examples in my lecture misled you to thinking that this is what I should design. But then those were meant to show you that all spaces have user effect. All spaces have different effects depending on the time, depending on the decay, depending on all of these things. When you take out all the colors, all the stimulus, all the light, all the texture, or the pattern, or the shapes, what remains of the space is really like all of these: disturbing, desolate, suppressed. I like to commend not the design but the effort to making it as realistic as possible. All right. These are also, this has the left side also. Oh, the decay was really I mean made to appear all like the walls were peeling off, the floorboards are deteriorating and everything. So we do not design, again, we do not design to have a, to affect a negative, to conjure a negative emotion from our users. We always want to go for positive effect. Okay, so on the right side looks perhaps needed more elements to make it look more done. As it is, it looks really I don't know, awkward a little bit. That painting should have been bigger, lower. Because if you imagine this 6 meters, I think 5 meters, the height, the person will be somewhere in the middle. Almost all of you, almost everyone, by the way, with the exception of very few, have the scale of the focal object wrong. Again, if you think of the focal object as a real object in real time with a real measurement, and imagine your corridor is 3 meters and your flower pot occupies almost all of that. So that's a 2-meter flower pot with a 1.5 meter of leaf and a 2 meters of flower. I mean, in real life, that would not be a realistic scale. But for this exercise, I've understood that all our design sensibilities are adjusting. So I'd like to point out not the scale, but the light, the shadows, and the color, that everyone did well. Okay, we'll just tackle scale on the next module. Module 4. Okay, the last one, this one also. On the left side, I think this is a lot of potential. I have not seen any corridor with paint spots, splotches on the wall or on the floor or any surface. This is the only one. However, it looks really rapidly done. On the right side also, perhaps this was made to look like a forest, and there are examples of enchanted corridors with like forested and landscaped appeal. Perhaps this would have been made better. But again, my emphasis in showing these last set is that any space will have an effect on your user. So while we design to have positive effect, we also realize that at the end life of all our spaces will have different emotions, the user. Okay, so minor plate number 2 is about contrasting conjuring experiences using with a specific notion that physical form, how you arrange the elements of the physical form of the structure will affect the space within. And both of them are very, very crucial. And I'd like to argue that what's more important is the space within, because that's what you will inhabit. But of course, the physical aspect, the way the arches are, the shapes, the texture, um, the walls, the way the walls are pierced with windows, all of these are visually very stimulating. Okay, so when we have vertical lines, when we have shapes, when we have wide openings, we expand the space, we widen the space. When we have fine openings and sharp shadows, and with texture and color, we create a dynamic space. And with rhythmic columns or beams perpendicular to the corridor, again, we widen the space, and then we decrease the speed of the visual travel and decrease the tunnel effect. Okay, so all in all, everyone, most of you did a wonderful job. When I look at the corridor, um, really sense I really sense that each of these corridors evoke different types of emotions. But when we look at, so as transition to the next module, when we look at your corridors here, these ones are really, really good, these three. But we look at them, when you look at the chair, white chair, and we look at the table at the end of on the right side. When you look at that, when you look at these things, this one, you will wonder, why would I go there? Why would I sit there? And if I go there, what will I do there? For example, here, there are no books. There are no chairs. For example, here, perhaps I need a table where I put my coffee, carpet. Here, would I sit on the floor? Perhaps I need more pillows here. There's when we when we when we revisit the space, we tend to sense that something is missing or slightly off, and then in a sense that when you are imagine yourself really standing in that corridor, why would you go at the end? Why would you go at the end at those painting when you can look at it from the inside, from far away? Is it too claustrophobic? Is it too what's the missing element? Okay, so that's our transition to the next module. Everything, again, our emphasis here is just for you, for all of us, to remember that we arrange things, the form, to create a space. Okay, so the lack lies not primarily on your design solution, but in the limitations and the specifications of the design problem and rationale. So the word why that space, why that end wall, why those furniture, why that window. So perhaps it's time now to unpack more of the design problem in order to make a more rational design solution. And that's what the next module is about. So it is not enough that we know what formal elements and components to arrange in order to achieve a certain experience. We need to know who will experience the space and how to arrange the formal elements. Because my big guess is that when I gave you minor plate number 2 and gave you the task of arranging all these things to create an experience, most of you did search for precedent in Google Images or in free sites, Pinterest, and etc. And what seems pleasing to your eyes, you duplicated that, tweaked that a little bit. So that's that's helpful for that minor plate number 2, because again, we want to identify the physical elements and we want to be aware how arranging them will create an effect on the space or an influence on the space. It's time now to move to the next level, and that's to know who will experience the space and how to actually arrange them, so that even if you do not have Google and you do not have Pinterest and Pixabay and ArcDaily and all of these books, you will still be able to create a design. Okay? And you'll still be able to create a design solution that is rational. Ibig sabihin, with a conviction, with the reason, and with purpose. Okay, so that's what the next module is about. So in the next module, you will learn different design styles, showing how to arrange specific components of an interior space. So this will add to your understanding of how to create an experience in a space. So we have now in our vocabulary the elements of form, which is define ground, columns, focus, barrier, etc. We also have the components of space, light, color, texture, ventilation, temperature. And so we will add this another set of vocabulary, which are the different interior design styles and a component of an interior space, which will hopefully be the bridge for you to be able to design on your own and not depend on precedent and design books and pictures from elsewhere. Okay, so in the next module, you'll learn these different design styles, and you'll also learn the different components of an interior space. Okay, and in the next project, we will do something very important, which is a user characterization in order to help you imagine the context of a space. Because without that limit, without knowing who are you designing for, it's very difficult. It tends to be very difficult to design a space, to conceptualize a space without a person there, even if that person is you. But then I will introduce someone else in this next project. Okay? So what I'd like you to do next is first to view the lectures. Do not go directly to the plate. If you go there, I'm sure you get overwhelmed and you will not have the fuel to do the plate as instructed. So I'd like you to view the lectures. The lectures, again, I encourage you, because I speak slow, I encourage you to just increase the playback speed, so that you can hear me fast and just get to the points that you need. So view the lectures, take notes, and then so you have, at the end of those lectures, you have to know what are the 5 elements of interior space. And when you study these elements in the interior space, do not forget the elements of form. Do not forget the platform, the barrier of the walls, the window openings. Do not forget the components of space, the light, the color, the temperature. Put that at the backside of your brains as you input another set. Okay? Because believe me, your brains have a very nice way of mixing them all up. Okay, and just taking it in. Okay, so you have to have 5 components of interior space, and at least 8 design styles, 8 to 12 interior design styles, including modern. So there you will learn what modern design actually is. You just I saw some designers use the term minimalist or minimalism but the design does not look anything minimal. So you'll learn how to use these terms, these design styles, what's a modern style, what's the elements and components of a modern style, formal style, mid-century modern, what's a French country, what's shabby chic, what's coastal, and etc. All of these things. So, and what's minimalist. So you have to take the next lecture. That's one of the most exciting part of this subject. And then after you take notes, then you read the major plate number 1 instructions. I attached a PDF file of that. attach that to the to the section where you need to submit it, and then begin conceptualization. So in order for us to have a glimpse of major plate number 1, I'll just give you a summary, okay, before you do anything, okay, because your curiosity might get the better of you. Okay, so major plate number 4, I titled it Design Emily's Bedroom. So there are 3 important considerations for this major plate. Number 1, we have an expanded volumetric limit. So from the 3 meters, we have 4. And then you have to apply a specific interior design style, which you will learn from the lectures. And number 3, you will have now a user identity and a user analysis or characterization. So you will ideate Emily. All right. So the new volumetric limit for this plate is 4 by 4 by 2.4 meter, and specifically a bedroom. In order to help you and take some of the load off that design, I provided a master guide layout of that bedroom. In the PDF, I already placed there where the bed should be, what are the elements on the right side and the left side, where the window should be. So that's a master guide layout of the bedroom. What you need to do is to change all the elements. So you do not need to think if 2 bed ba siya or double deck or whatever. It's 1 bed, 1 queen bed size. So you need to do some very basic research on furniture dimension, especially the bed, the door, and of course the mounting height of side tables, for example. Okay, so that's for the volumetric limit. Next is the interior design style. So you have to choose among the ones discussed in the lecture. There are many choices, and you can also combine them. And you need to change the element shown in the master guide bedroom. For example, the master guide looks like a modern design. So I need you to change everything so that it becomes whatever you choose becomes bohemian, becomes mid-century or contemporary or French country or etc. Okay, and then number 3, to guide you, and I think this is a very worthy starting point for any design project, and to understand the user and to characterize the user identity. So see Emily as depicted in the poem by, or study Emily as depicted in the poem by Billy Collins entitled Taking Off Emily Dickinson's Clothes and written in 1998. Okay, so that's uh, regardless of the title, that's you can read that at your age. You can read that. That's not pornographic or anything. Okay, so what I need you to do as you study Emily in this poem, and that's Emily as in Emily Dickinson's, is to change the poem setting. I think the poem setting is 18th century or early 19th century, 18th century. So obviously that's not in the modern era. So what you can do in the user identity is to change that setting in order for your Emily not to be and locked in that time, in order for your Emily to be transported to our present era and make a contemporary bedroom instead of a very old, or I mean instead of a very shabby chic, for example, bedroom. But of course, you could also interpret the bedroom as it is and not change anything. That's also is up to you. So just a reminder, when you search this poem in the internet, you write the whole title and place full text at the end of the phrase in order for you to read, I think, the 9 stanza completely read the 9 stanzas of this poem. It's a very short, easy read actually. And again, it's not something that it's something that your parents can read with you if that's what you're thinking. Okay, so that's major plate number 4, Design Emily's Bedroom. Okay, so the salient dates. Next week is the reading break. We'll not do consultations. We'll just resume on November 11 and 12. And I moved the deadline 5 days after. So it's supposed to be November 10. Moved it November 15. Okay, that's a Monday. But on the reading break, you can consult with me if you have done any type of conceptualization. All right. So I also included. So the submission here is the same Google link and the image, but what's um, what's included very crucial is I will include an open PowerPoint file where you will, para wala na tayong concept paper. So much like what I'm showing you here, I will assign a page for you. You place there one picture, and on the left side you uh, briefly describe your Emily. My Emily is a working girl, or shall I say college girl, or is a woman of color, and etc. etc. So your user characterization will be reflected on that one slide together with a picture of the bedroom. Okay, so that's on November 17, and then we'll do the batch conference 2 days after that. All right. Okay, so I'll just do one batch conference because Saturday is too far. So I'll just do one and then just post the recording to all of you. Okay. Okay, so once again, thank you very much for your participation in your submissions for minor plate number 2. It has been a pleasure checking all of them again. Kudos to everyone. Heads up because this is a really good progress. I mean, as a batch, this is really good progress. So from the Narcissus style, we moved to the form and space of the corridor, and now we are going to the bedroom, including a specific user and an interior design style to help guide you to arrange and to put together all the formal elements and spatial components. Okay, so heads up for the next major project. This is your major project number 1. And have a nice day, everyone. Take care of yourselves and just keep in touch whenever, if you have any questions. Okay, thank you.